Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this new webinar from the International Energy Agency. This is still under our capacity reinforcement program on energy data and energy modeling. And today we'll spend 2 hours together and you'll be introduced to the topic of energy modeling and modeling tools for long-term planning of the energy system. So some of you might be very familiar and already working on different modeling tools for specific parts of the energy system, like the power sector. Some of you might have more specific expertise and knowledge on other parts of the energy system. What we'll try to do today is to give you a common background and understanding of what is energy modeling and long-term planning, what does that entail, and how can we do it and have a comprehensive and integrated approach, looking at all the sectors, taking into consideration where energy demand will come from in the future: transport, agriculture, industry, buildings, etc. Taking into account what the need for energy will be, from primary energy to be supplied to final energy like power or like refined oil products in the transport sector, for instance. And so we'll have those 2 hours together, one break time at the middle for Q&A, and also break time at the end for more questions and answers, and going through the Excel exercise you have received. Just to position where we are in our online course. So last week you've been taken through statistics and how to deal with the past and current situation. And we cannot do modeling and we cannot look at the future if we don't rely on good and rich data on the present. So this was last week. Now we will have more sessions on modeling every day this week. So today we start with the introduction. Tomorrow we'll look at demand from one end-use sector, which will be the building sector as an illustration. Thursday, it will be about the power sector, and Friday, we'll look at the supply side of the energy system and discussing hydrocarbons. Next week, you will have other modeling sessions, not taught by IEA experts, but by academic partners who are also working on energy modeling tools and who will be able to present their approaches and some work they've been doing. So as you know, we are under virtual, so if you have any question, any need for clarification, please raise your hand. And you can also, of course, use the Q&A box. So I'd like to start with some mentee polling questions as we begin. So I invite you to go to www.mentee.com and to use the code that is on the up part of the screen. I read it. It's 29698899. And I'd like to start with a very, very broad question, asking to you, in your opinion, what are energy models useful for? Okay, so we're getting some first answers. Forecasting is something that comes several times, and indeed, it's about forecasting, or we'll define a bit more accurately the terminology, but looking at the future, estimating, trying to foresee what would the future look like. It's not about prediction. We don't have a crystal ball or ability to know what will happen for sure in the future, but based on hypotheses, taking assumptions, we can make some estimation or forecast, which are conditional to some assumptions we take. Analyzing data is indeed something energy models can help do. We can analyze historical data and historical and current situation before looking ahead and trying to see how the situation would evolve. Planning, long-term planning are indeed, let's say, end final end use purposes of those models. We don't do modeling just for the pleasure of complex tools. The idea is to bring policymakers with some clear information, helping planning and helping development of the energy system, helping in guiding investment, helping developing the right policies. So thanks for your very interesting feedback on this question. Another one is, in your opinion, when we will discuss how to develop an energy model, how to develop those tools, what are the elements that we should consider in priority in your opinion? So you would see that the 5 options we propose are all relevant and interesting. So there is no wrong answer. There is no good answer either, but it'd be interesting to see what you prioritize. Okay, so the quality of input data is ranking very high, and indeed, if we don't have reliable input data, you won't have reliable output results and conclusion. So that's indeed a very important part. The model objective as well, because it's not, again, it's not a tool for the sake of a tool. It needs to answer a concrete question, and we need to define what's the aim and what the goal of the model. And other information are also very key, as we said, the assumptions that will help us define scenario, timeliness of input data, but also predictable political trajectories that we will use in our scenarios as well. So thanks for your answers. I'd like to ask you one more about, to you, what are the main drivers of future energy demand trends? So what of those parameters would mostly drive the evolution of energy demand in the future? Okay, so interestingly, most of you are voting for population growth, and some of you for GDP growth. Actually, these are indeed the main socioeconomic drivers that will be at the as input and at the beginning of our modeling exercise. And when we do energy modeling, we can rely on other institutions' projections. For example, population, you would have the UN doing some projection on demographics, and we can use that as input to our model. For GDP growth, we can also do our own estimation or rely on other institutions like the International Monetary Fund or even national information from Ministry of Economy. So these are very important drivers. What is the most important? There is no good or right answer. It depends on the country. In regions like sub-Saharan Africa, where demographics are very dynamic, population growth would be indeed maybe the most important driver. In regions where population is more stable, like Europe, GDP evolution would be the main driver. Energy access is also a very, very strong driver to future energy demand. In a case of reaching universal access to electricity in Africa, this would mean, of course, a lot of increase in the energy demand from households on electricity, for example. Okay, one last question before we move to the course, more practical. So let's imagine, and we'll enter into that in the exercise, but if we want to understand passenger road transport in a country, what data, what parameters and variables do you think we need mostly to play and to make estimations under an energy model? So you have 4 proposals. Okay, so number of cars is indeed a very important parameter. Average annual kilometer or miles traveled by car is also part of the answer. Actually, all of these information are key, and you would see that passenger kilometer is an aggregated or built variable taking into account the number of cars, the average mileage per car, and the number of passenger per car in order to reflect the intensity of passenger road transport. So we'll need to have all this information if we want to make reliable predictions on how these mobility services for passengers using road transport would evolve in the future. Okay, so coming back to our presentation. So today we'll start with general principles on energy modeling and the rationale behind building some scenarios. Then we will illustrate more how can we make modeling for demand of energy of the different end use sectors. We'll have a short break for Q&A, and in the second part of the session, we'll discuss transformation processes, so power sector and refineries moving from primary energy to secondary energies, and then we'll discuss supply, so primary sources of energy. In this section, we will discuss some general principles on energy modeling and on how to build scenarios. So, as we all know, the energy sector is at the heart of our societies, and it is very linked to our climate and to our environment. There is no energy island, which means that what will happen in one country matters for the rest of the world, and what will happen in one sector has impact in other sectors. Stakeholders in the energy space are interested in understanding better the trends and the potential futures, but also to understand the possible technologies and fuel options, which each have advantages and disadvantages. So how can energy modeling and energy scenario help? Well, first, they can bring an integrated view of different key driving forces in a holistic, consistent, and disciplined way. Second, energy modeling and scenario enable to explore alternative futures and deal with uncertainties, for example, providing sensitivities analysis. And third, modeling and scenario help understanding how different technological options can meet the requirements. There is no ideal model. A model is a tool which is built to answer a specific answer. So each model has strengths and weaknesses. At the IEA, our models are deeply rooted into more details on approach towards the future and to discuss a bit terminology. So when we consider the future, we can try to predict what will happen in any case, but this is about prophecy. What we do under energy modeling is to try to predict what happens if some conditions are met, and then we are exploring scenario, we are forecasting and foreseeing, but we can also try to investigate what should happen for a certain objective to be met. For example, if we want universal access to clean cooking and electricity to be reached by 2030, what would be the optimum trajectory by that date? When we design energy models, we need first to ask ourselves what is the objective of this model, what is its scope, and what will be its different features. And as a start, looking at historical data is fundamental because the level of details available will define how reliable and accurate the model will be. Then there are questions on coverage, what sector, what geographical areas, what type of fuels we want to take into account in the energy model. In terms of approach and techniques, there are different. We will present them in the coming slides. We can also integrate specific features like endogenous technological learning, where, for example, we will say that the cost of a given technology, for example, solar PV, would decrease over time as the deployment of this technology increases. We can also include macroeconomic feedback, for example, in an oil producer country, if we take assumptions on the exports of oil, this might have impact on the GDP of the country. And GDP is usually an input information, as we will discuss later on. So this can impact the entire energy model. But the design of the model will very much rely on drawing a line between what is exogenous and what is endogenous. And we will never insist enough on that. Data requirements will totally depend on the model design and will strongly impact the model. We cannot do projection, we cannot look at the future if we don't have statistics and data that enable us to understand the present and to understand the past and where we come from. How can we make projections on the future of energy demand? There are two main methodologies, and the first approach is on end use. It's a bottom-up or an engineering approach. Here, the idea is to use a physical relationship between energy and the end use devices, the processes, the services. Let's take an example. If we want to estimate what will be the demand for electricity in the residential sector in 10 years, we could disaggregate the residential sector, look at each and every need household would have. For example, there is a need for lighting, for cooking, for powering some appliances. So we will look sector by sector, what are the needs, what is the final energy demand, what are the devices that will provide those services. So there would be different type of lighting bulbs, LEDs, what will be the consumption of each of those devices, and we will be able to get a number of the electricity demand for this sector. So this approach is highly disaggregated and it enables very precise analysis. Although it's complex and data consuming, it is very appropriate for the midterm and the long term. Another approach for estimating future energy demand is to look at econometric established relations, for example, between energy demand and economic variables. Again, if we want to estimate the future electricity demand in the residential sector, we could try to look what is the level today and to see how it's linked to the GDP per capita. And if we look at the evolution of the GDP per capita, we could try to estimate what will be the evolution of electricity demand. And this will be based on established relationships between those two variables based in the past, based in other regions and comparable countries. So this type of approach is made at a very aggregated level. It's not made at the end use level, so it's simpler, but it is less accurate. This approach is very appropriate for the short term. When we want to project and to estimate what the future of energy supply could be, again, there are two methodologies. The first one is about optimization. We ensure minimizing a variable under like cost and ensuring that it meets all the constraints. So it can be having a level of electricity produced at the lower cost, having an electricity mix at the lower emission factor. Another methodology is about simulation, where we will simulate behaviors of both energy consumers and energy producers. For example, we will take one signal that would be price of the oil barrel, and see, depending on the price, how much oil consumer will ask for and how much oil producer would be able to bring to the market. And then you do iterations to find an equilibrium between consumption and production. On this slide, we are trying to recap a mapping of those different energy models and approaches. So as we said, you can be under a deductive approach and do some forecasting. So what the future is likely to look like given a set of assumptions. So if we have these policies, if we continue with this type of technology, what will the future look like? And on the right end of the slide, you can see another approach, which is strategic planning. So this is a normative methodology where we will set an objective, universal access to electricity, reduction of CO2 emissions as per our climate agreement, and we will try to deduct and backcast what would be the pathway to get there. Then, in terms of modeling methodology, as we say, there are bottom-up methodologies and top-down. There are many different models and existing tools to do energy modeling. At the IEA, we use what we call the World Energy Model that we will present into more details. Energy modeling relies on scenario. And to build a scenario, it is needed to develop sets of policies that will describe different future pathways. Creating a coherent storyline among policy, prices, deployment, and development of energy sources and technologies are important, and it is needed to ensure that all that makes sense together. At the International Energy Agency, the flagship publication World Energy Outlook relies on two main scenarios. The first one is the stated policy scenario, or STEPS, which holds up a mirror to the actions and the intentions of today's policymakers. In other words, it is a deductive approach where we provide a candid assessment of what would happen if those policy actions and intentions are implemented, and what will be the implication for energy markets, for energy security, for emissions. Another scenario, which comes from a normative approach, is the sustainable development scenario. It provides a strategic pathway to meet global climate goals air quality, and energy access in full. So here the idea is to say what should be the pathway if we want to have universal access by 2030, if we want to be aligned with our climate and air quality goals. But we can also develop ad hoc analyses, cases, sensitivities, and in the case of Africa, in 2019, the World Energy Outlook presented the Africa case, which includes as targets the Agenda 2063 of Africa Union goals for inclusive and sustainable socioeconomic growth, in addition to universal access to both electricity and clean cooking, and to improvement of air quality. This is a simplified chart of the International Energy Agency World Energy Model, or WEM, and we will come to this slide many times in the coming sessions and the coming trainings. You can see on the top part of the chart some green arrows, which are the input assumptions. On the bottom part, you have the output with orange arrows, including energy flows, so the energy balances, associated CO2 emissions, and investment required to have those energy systems. And the heart of the modeling, of the energy modeling tool itself, is broken down into different subsections. So going from the right to the left, on the right we have the final energy demand sectors: industry, transport, buildings, agriculture, and we will look at the services which require energy and the end use demand. Left to that, we will deduct the transformation processes, refinery, power sector, and the primary energy demand related to that. So oil, oil demand, coal, gas, but also resources for power generation. On the top left side, you have the supply modeling section with fossil fuel supply, but very importantly as well, trade matrices, import, export of oil, of gas, as well as domestic production. And the fossil fuel prices will play a role of equilibrium between supply and demand. Developing models requires to take assumptions. And at the IEA, our modeling exercises rely on various sets of data, including IEA internal statistics and research, as well as external data available. When it comes to cost, it is very important to have regular peer review of the hypothesis, because cost can evolve very, very quickly and be outdated very, very quickly. At the IEA, all our main assumptions are made publicly available and transparent in our website and in our publication. And what ensures the robustness and the seriousness of our work is that each and every report is peer reviewed by many experts from different sectors, from different sources and regions. In the model, the input includes exogenous assumptions. And those assumptions are related to socioeconomic drivers, like how population will evolve in the future, how GDP is to evolve. So we can rely on other institutions' predictions, like IMF, or make our own predictions. Then we will take as exogenous assumption the policies that government would take, for example, energy policies in the renewable space, with targets that could be fixed by government, with standards that would be implemented, or support measure to certain energy technologies, energy access targets, subsidies removal rates that will also help the assumption and be input to the model. Technology assumptions are key as well, including investment, efficiency of the technology, cost of the capital for deploying those technologies, as well as assumptions on infrastructure development. How long does it take to develop a hydropower dam, for example? In this section, we will present energy demand modeling, starting with general principles and then illustrating with industry, transport, and building sectors. Coming back to our simplified chart of the world energy model, we are on the right part, so looking at final energy demand that will enable us to understand transformation processes in the second step. So what do we want to do in the demand side modeling modules of the world energy outlook? We are building on a bottom-up modeling of the energy sector, and this is done for 25 regions of the world, encompassing power, heat, and other transformation, and looking at the final sectors, which are industry, transport, buildings, and others. The objective is to get an explicit idea of the sector and the technology-specific parameters, which would be specific to each region and country as well. We want to know about stocks of equipments, future capacities and future sales of such equipment, lifetime of each unity, each equipment, cost and related efficiencies. And this applies to the car fleet in a country, but also to the power plant, where we would like to understand again stock, future capacity, and features of each of those plants. Each and every module of the demand modeling are structured in the same way. The question we want to answer is what will be the final energy demand coming from transport, from industry, from agriculture? And to answer this question, we need to ask ourselves what is the real demand for energy services? So, what is the requested useful energy? And what will be the technologies, the fuels, the equipment that will meet these, that will provide these services? Sometimes it's not easy to have estimation of how the demand for energy services will evolve. So we need to define some drivers to make those estimations. So let's take an example on residential sector. If we want to estimate how the demand for electricity in the residential sector will evolve, we can look at one specific topic that would be lighting. And the question is, how will households want to get lighting services in the future? We may know what is the demand today for electricity for lighting houses, but we don't know very well how this will evolve. So we can try, based on econometric analysis, to estimate this. And a driver that could be a good indication of lighting services could be the square meters per capita. And here, again, based on econometric analysis, we can try to project how the square meter per capita will evolve in a certain country, maybe function of the GDP per capita, and assuming that we know how the GDP per capita is projected to evolve based on projections from socioeconomic analysis, we can estimate how the square meter per capita will evolve. And then, based on what we observed in the past, what we observe in similar countries, we can estimate how the demand for lighting will evolve for all those houses, for all those meters per capita. From there, we'll be able to anticipate how demand for lighting will increase and to understand what is the part of this demand which is provided by existing technologies, how those technologies, how those equipments like the existing light bulbs will last, and there will be a retirement of those old technologies. So if we want to meet the new demand, we have a need for new equipments, and based on a cost-based approach, we will be estimating what type of technology will be deployed. For example, for the lighting need, we could have super efficient LED as well as more basic light bulbs. And based on economic analysis, we can estimate what will be the share of super efficient LED that will be bought by people and what will be the share of more basic lighting bulbs. Each of those technology, so this diverse portfolio of technology has for each different efficiency levels. So we will be able to convert this need for useful energy into a need for final energy based on the efficiency of each equipment. Different strategies will be implied for different sectors. Here, if we look at the sustainable development scenario, we can see how total final consumption would evolve by sector and by fuel. And we can see that in the transport sector, there is a sharp decline in the total final consumption that also leads to a decline in the CO2 emissions. But we don't have such evolution in industry and buildings. One reason that would be that due to the expansion of electricity access, the total final consumption in building is not decreasing. So in each end use sector module, the questions we want to answer is what will be the need for new equipments in the future? And this requires to ask the first question, which is what is the end use demand in the future? Then how much equipment needs to be replaced, how much new equipment we will need. And to do that, we are asking ourselves which are the technologies chosen to meet the estimated end use demand and what is the influence of energy policies. In our case of lighting, we could try to estimate what if the government puts standards which provide from importing very basic lighting bulbs, but really supports the deployment of super efficient LED. This would have an impact in our exercise of allocating the different technologies to meet the end use needs. And another question we want to answer is what will be the associated and the resulting final energy demand and the associated CO2 emissions and investment. Now we will very quickly illustrate this on the industry sector. So the industry demand module is disaggregated per sector. So we will have different industrial sector, aluminium, cement, etc. And in our model, we will, as usual, have as inputs socioeconomic drivers like GDP, population, but also historic production of industry products and end-use energy prices. In terms of activity variable, we will take into consideration physical production. So if we want to estimate the future energy demand from the cement industry, we might take as a variable the tons of cement which will be produced in the future and deduct from the tons of cement what would be the energy demand. For some sectors where we don't have a physical production, we can look at the value added of this specific industry. This is an example of results that we can get in our analysis looking at Africa industry. Here you can see 4 countries with 2018 levels of demand on cement and on steel in 2018 and in 2040 according to our projections. And we have also compared these levels to those of India in 2018. So steel and cement demand per capita is one example of parameter we will project so that we get a better understanding of what could be the total energy demand coming from the industry. And the interesting part of the analysis is that we are able also to look at what would be the share of imports and the share of domestic production. Another analysis that we are bringing to your attention in the industry sector is about motors, because most of the energy demand in the industry sector comes from motor-driven system, and this is where efficiency matters a lot, because there is a high potential with efficiency measures to decrease the energy demand in the industry sector, looking at the efficiency of motors. Moving to the transport sector. So when it comes to transport, we again need to disaggregate. So we know that there is transport on roads, aviation, rail, navigation. So this will be our disaggregated subsectors. And we will look for activity variables that will depend on whether we're looking at passengers or goods. As usual, we have socio-economic indicators as input of the model, including population, GDP, and historical data. So as discussed, the activity variable we will rely on are passenger kilometers, which is basically an aggregated indicator of vehicle fleet, distance traveled on average by one car, and occupation rates, so number of people in one car. And this number will be a good indication of the intensity of how much people want to travel on the road with cars. We will have the same type of indicator with goods on ton kilometers, where we will multiply vehicle fleet by distance traveled by load factor or quantity of good in the trucks. Again, if we look at one analysis we have done on the future of Africa transport, we can focus on evolution of vehicle ownership, and here we have made projections on the level of cars and two and three wheelers owned by thousands of people in Africa. The key message is that it is expected to grow very fast, to grow further in the Africa case scenario. And you have countries like Ghana, where the number of two and three wheelers per thousand people is expected to triple. We also need to remember that this is per thousand people and the population itself will grow. So there is expectation of much more cars, much more two, three wheelers in the roads in Africa in the coming decades. Another result of our outlook exercise on the Africa transport is based on evolution of the car fleet, based on evolution of passenger kilometers indicators, of ton kilometers indicators. We can have an estimation on how total energy demand for the transport sector will evolve. So starting in 2018, we see that there is a breakdown where road passenger makes the bulk of the energy demand. By 2030, this is expected to grow, and the difference between our stated policy scenario and the Africa case is due to a higher GDP. That means more economic development, more cars in the roads, more trucks in the roads. Looking ahead to 2040, we can see that higher GDP again increases the demand for transport, but efficiency gain contributes to limit the growth. So again, there is a strong case for efficiency measures that can limit the growth of energy demand. Looking now at the building sector, so building is an aggregation of residential and services sector, where again we will have to segment and disaggregate by the type of energy need we are looking at. So we know that in buildings we are looking for space cooling, water heating, we are looking for energy for cooking, for lighting, for powering appliances. Here, the activity variables we will look at are floor space, so square meter per capita, number of households, appliances ownership, how many TV or how many phones does a household have on average, and we can also rely on services added value. As usual, our input data will be socioeconomic drivers, but also building specific indicators like urbanization or dwelling occupancy. Fuels to meet the needs in buildings because buildings are requiring electricity for lighting, for example, but also oil products, LPG for cooking, for instance, but it can also be heat, gas for cooking, etc. We can see that this is a totally different story if we are under our sustainable development scenario at the global level, where CO2 emissions coming from the building sector are expected to decrease, and we will see an increasing share of electricity as the main fuel providing the energy services for the building sector. One key analysis specific to Africa about cooling. As you may know, today there are 700 million people who need cooling services in Africa today because they live in places where the average temperature every day does never go below 25 degrees. In 2040, this number will rise to 1.2 billion because of population growth and because of global warming. Today, the equipment in air conditioner, fans is very low, but with middle class rising and with population growth and urbanization, we expect that the demand for cooling services will increase a lot by 2040, and this will translate into a demand for electricity in the building sector. Still, if some efficiency measures are implemented, there is a potential to divide by two this increase in the electricity demand. For example, implementing standards to import the most advanced air conditioner and the most efficient fans. Okay, so we'll take now some first questions. I see already two which are asked, but please feel free to ask more. First one is, can you combine bottom-up and econometric approaches when modeling? And the answer is yes, and this is something we will see, for example, tomorrow in the illustration with the building sector and in the short Excel exercise we have sent, where we do bottom up in the sense that we disaggregate a lot each end use sector, and we look at what are the different drivers for future electricity demand coming from residential needs for cooling, for example. But at some point, when we need to project some proxy variables like the size of households or a number of AC units per dwelling, we would use econometric approaches, taking into account relations we know based on historical data, based on what we observe in other countries, to see if GDP per capita evolved in that direction. This is how the number of AC units, or this is how the dwelling occupancy could evolve relatively. So this is something we can do as a combination of those two approaches. Another question on the scope of our analysis. So the IEA is working at global level and regional and country level, depending on the exercise. So we have 26 regions and covering the entire world. And for Africa, there are 3 regions. Number one is North Africa. So the 5 countries from Morocco to Egypt. Number 2 is South Africa, the country itself, and number 3 is rest of Africa, which is very broad. We know, so we are trying to disaggregate more, and depending on on the type of book or analysis, we are able to go deeper into a specific region or a specific country. In the Africa Energy Outlook 2019 publication that I'm often referring to, now you can see it very well, we have done individual models for 11 countries, including Ghana. So we have results projections for Ghana, and we would also have for other key countries. And then we will also, depending on the analysis, aggregate on the region. I think when we break down Africa, we aim to provide numbers for north, west, east, central, and southern part, trying to keep those regions and to stick to the breakdown of the ECOWAS, the East African Community, the SADC one, and the Central African Group as well. One of the questions on the bottom-up and econometric approaches, the question, I'm not sure I clearly understand it, but the correlation is often what we look for in the econometric approach. We're wondering if there is a link that we could observe in the past or from other countries on how GDP per capita evolve or how population evolve with how much electricity is consumed in the residential sector, for example, and this is what we'll try to define, and we'll see it more into details tomorrow. How we can define this correlation link? Is there some easy mathematical formula of a linear link, or is it a more complex curve? But we can still work on it and see if the proxy variable like the GDP per capita evolves in a direction over time, how the variable we're looking for would evolve consequently. So I have a few more questions for you. So I suggest you go back, sorry, to mentee for a few more polling questions. Okay, you shall be able to see my screen, and so it's still the same code. I'd be interested to know which modeling or projection tools you've been using, if any, so that we understand a bit better the kind of exercises you've been working on. And tools can be Excel, of course, and we will mostly work under Excel during this online training, since it's enabled to do many things already. Okay, Leap, you can see Excel. Stata. Okay, so it looks like Excel is a main one, and good news, this is something we'll be working on together. But there are many other, as we said, tools that are really well designed to answer a specific question rather than another. And some tools are very easy to access, not too complex, open source. Some others would require more training, skills, and sometimes license fees. So in the landscape, you have a very different available tools. But yeah, good that Excel is a common tool for most of you. Next question is, when you work on projection, on looking at the future, what is the time horizon do you usually consider? Is it short term, below 5 years? Is it below a decade, or is it above a decade? And And I guess depending on who is answering, you might not be looking at exactly the same time horizon. Okay, so we have a very nice stare of most people using short-term, below 5 years time horizon, but also some of you are looking longer term. Actually, it depends on the type of exercise you are doing. As you know, for some energy infrastructure, they are very. It takes a lot of time to develop them because it goes from the design, the financing, the building. For something like a large hydro dam, it can last really a long time. So it's important to know future long-term energy demand trends so that we can plan accordingly those long infrastructures. But for other topics, it might be more relevant to look at short term. We'll be interested to discuss more and to understand what exactly you're doing when you look at each time horizon. One last question regarding how to work on those modeling tools, at least from the IEA modeling approach. Energy prices are a component of the modeling exercise. We need to work on those prices, to question ourselves how they will evolve in the future, and what would that entail. According to you, what are energy prices useful for in such a modeling exercise? Okay, so in our perspective, and we'll enter more into details, prices are indeed used to balance supply and demand. And so this entails that it relates to affordability for household, but more generally for consumers. And it also relates to the level of investment and the profitability of developing those energy sources for the producers, for the companies. So exactly, energy prices are really here to make this balance. If the price is too low, there will be little incentive for investor, or they will not make enough money for developing the resources. If the price is too high, the demand will be lower. So we simulate and we do iterations to find energy prices that will match supply and demand, and we'll enter more into the details in a second. But all answers are good, related to the level of investment and affordability as well as trade. So coming back to our presentation, I just wanted to share a few findings or a few illustration of energy modeling for the case of Ghana. As I just mentioned, we have developed an Africa energy outlook, including Ghana energy outlook with projections. So here on this table, you would see historical data as well as projected data according to two scenarios, stated policies and Africa case. We'll look here at socioeconomic drivers, which are input like GDP and population. Then some outputs of our model, some results would be regarding electricity access, with people having and having not access to electricity, access to clean cooking, and also CO2 emissions. So these are one of the end results of our entire modeling exercise once we look at each and every demand subsector, once we look at transformation processes for the power sector, for refineries, once we look at supply, we can deduct and consolidate all the CO2 emissions according to those different scenarios. You can also see a table with policies, targets, and measures we have identified. And in case this is not accurate, not updated, please feel free to share your updated elements here. But just to say that this is a kind of announced policies or steps which are taken into consideration when we do a scenario, when we do a stated policy scenario projecting where the country is expected to go, where those policies, measures, targets to be effectively followed, implemented, and met. So this is a bit the starting point. Just to show you a few results on what, according to those different scenarios, the primary energy demand of Ghana would look like in the future. So depending on the scenario, it's not the same because the underlying hypotheses are not the same. The Africa case is taking as input hypothesis a higher GDP. So to power this larger economy, more primary energy is needed and a slightly different mix is needed as well. Africa case also includes universal access to electricity and cooking with, for example, more oil under the form of LPG for clean cooking. So there is a series of assumptions, but you can see what the future could look like according to those. Another output, I was mentioning CO2 emissions. We can also deduct investment needs and cumulative over the period and see how they are broken down per fuel, per type of investment in the power sector, if it's on the network themselves, the grids, or on the generating capacity, and investments related to bringing access to population, access to energy, both electricity and clean cooking. So we'll be happy to discuss more of those results, the reasoning behind, and to present different information related to the exercise we did. It dates back to 2019, so it could be updated, and would be very happy to work with you more on this to see if it can be helpful to your respective activities. We have one question is, are we going to be trained on TIMES modeling tool? So the IEA is indeed using TIMES, which is a modeling software. Under this training and for this online course, we will mostly work on Excel with the Excel and exercises handbook you have received, because it's more about explaining the reasoning, the mechanics, the links. In a second step, and when we will come to Accra to do more hands-on exercises and to work more concretely on modeling tools, we will have to define with you to assess what are the needs and what kind of tool or exercise we shall focus on. And all options are on the table because we are tool agnostic and working with many of them. So we might work together on times. Okay, so I'm coming back to the second part of the presentation, where we will discuss the power sector, refineries, and then supply of primary energy. In this section, we will present the energy modeling for the power sector and the refinery. In this section, we will present the energy modeling for the power sector and the refineries, so for transformation processes. In our world energy model simplified charts, so we are at the central part looking at transformation for power generation, which is often associated with heat production,
and looking at refinery. Power sector is very complex, and we will present more into details this slide in a dedicated sessions on modeling of power sector. But the two main questions we want to answer, looking at the future of the power sector, is what will be the new plants we need to add, and this is based on the existing stock of power plants and how they will evolve when they will be retired, and with the increase of the demand, so based on investment assumptions, on refurbishment of existing plants, we will be able to estimate what will be the need for new plants to be added. And the second quick key question we need to ask is what will be the merit order dispatch? So, in other words, how we will be able to meet at each second energy demand and to have a match between electricity demand and electricity supply by operating the right plants in a power mix where we would have solar PV producing during the day and base load power plants that would be also available in the day, but also at the peak of the demand in the night. The question is, when do we need to give priority to this or that technology based on different factors that would be cost, that would be CO2, etc. When it comes to integrating renewables into the electricity mix, there is some modeling to be done as well, looking at the potential of renewable energies, solar PV, wind, etc., and looking at the cost as well. So this will enable us to have a calculation on deployment of renewable energy and to estimate the needs for investment. What we observe is that decreasing cost and policy support are really bringing down the cost of renewables and are really bringing higher and higher the shares of renewable in most countries with important competitiveness. Let's have a look at one result of our modeling exercise on the African power sector, where on the left part you can see demand for electricity in Africa, and on the right part you can see how this demand is supplied, is provided by the electricity generation sources. So today, most of the electricity demanded in Africa is for productive uses, industry, agriculture, and there is also a significant part for households, and it's provided by sources which are gas, solar PV, hydro, and other sources for electricity generation. Based on our modeling, which comes from the demand sector, so how will evolve the demand in the building sector, in the industry sector, in the transport sector, we will have estimation of the future need for electricity. And here you can see that there is an important increase of productive electricity for productive uses for households which are already connected to the electricity today and that will have more appliances or more electricity needs. But also there will be a new demand from households who are not connected today and who will gain access to electricity. And the mix for generating this electricity will also evolve with an important role for gas, but the big winners will be modern renewables, specifically solar PV, who is expected to grow very fast. Another module into the transformation step of our world energy model is the refining model. And this model is really the link between oil demand. So, for example, demand for oil products in transport, gasoline, diesel, other LPG, and other products, and oil supply that will be crude oil. Meaning is the intermediate between the two. So we will have to look, as we always do, at the demand category of product per category, kerosene, We will have to look at the demand for refined product, how those refineries are operated, what are the runs of those refineries, and then as there is a lot of trade for oil products and for crude oil, we will have to balance region per region how the exchanges import exports from different regions. The results of our outlook would be for the oil sector. We can see that we expect oil production, so crude oil production in Africa, to be stable, while demand for oil, which derives from demand from oil products, is expected to increase. So considering the evolution of refinery runs, so how much crude oil will be converted into oil products, we can deduct what will be the expected net product imports, and this gives a very good indication of dependency on imports. In this section, we will describe energy modeling for the supply side. Coming back to our simplified chart of the world energy model, we are now looking at the left part, the supply of energy model. And we will see that fossil fuel prices have a key role. So the fossil fuel supply models are typically containing three models: oil, natural gas, and coal, even though oil and gas model are interlinked via natural gas liquids. The oil supply model is at a global level where supply and demand are in balance, whereas natural gas and coal, which are usually more domestically or regionally traded energies, are considered at regional level. For in the case of natural gas, there are some infrastructure which are like pipelines that determine where a certain production will be consumed, but we observe with LNG that natural gas is increasingly a global resource. To run those fossil fuel supply modules, there are many iterations between supply and demand, and price play a key role. And as you will see, there are different typologies and types of oil and gas. So prices play a key role of equilibrium in the world energy model because it is based on the idea that fossil fuel prices reflect levels which are sufficient for investment, but also to meet demand. So prices are at a level that makes that consumers can afford getting those resources, but at a level which is high enough that producer, so countries, companies, and investors can actually produce this resource and have economic return on their investment. So in this exercise, prices are derived through iterative modeling, and their trajectories are smooth and linear, even though we know that in reality, prices of oil, for example, are very, very volatile. We could have a more volatile and more and a less smooth trajectory, but this is not the goal of this modeling exercise, where we want to have long-term trajectories. So, for example, if we look at different projections of the price of crude oil, we see that under current policy or stated policy scenario, there is an increase of the price of oil barrel. And the main idea is that under the scenario, demand for oil is expected to grow, so the resources to be developed will be more and more costly. So this will be reflected in the price proposed by producers to consumers. In the case of the sustainable development scenario, we expect a decrease in demand for oil products. So there is also derived from that an expectation that the cost of production of the resource developed will be the lowest one, and on average, the crude oil price is expected to decline. One key specificity to the oil and gas sector is that, contrary to the power sector, you cannot switch on and switch off plant upon request. When you have an existing field producing oil or producing gas, this specific field has a profile of production. And if we look today at how the supply and the production of oil meets the demand, and if we look in the future, we can see that under our stated policy demand scenario, we expect demand for oil to increase slightly or remain stable, but the existing production of fields which are exploited today is to decrease naturally. So if we want to fill the gap and to continue meeting the demand, we need to invest in new fields. So one new investment will bring to the market additional resource, but this field will decrease over time, and this will be the case for all new fields. So there is a need to invest and to invest continuously to ensure that there is a match between demand and existing production. So there are calculations which are made at regional level to ensure that there is a match between demand for crude oil, refining capacity, and demand for oil products. Looking at one key output for Africa, here you can see the net income that can be made from oil and gas resources in the top 10 producers in the continent. What is striking is that there has been a high volatility of incomes over the last 2 decades, and if you link this to government expenditure, you can see that when the revenues went up, government expenditure went up at a rapid pace, but in case of decrease, it was more difficult for governments to decrease their expenditure. What can the future look like? So again, we need to make assumptions, to make different scenario. Under a stated policy scenario we did last year, we would expect to see, based on the prices and the levels of production, that the top 10 producers in Africa could go back to levels of revenues which are the average of the last decade. But under another scenario of faster energy transition, there would be less demand for oil and gas products, and then there might be less revenues for the key producers. To conclude, energy models are a framework which provide or enable analysis, but it is a simplified representation of the real world. And the level of detail, the level of accuracy of the model will depend on what question we want to answer and what are the data available. Energy systems modeling provide many inputs. It can provide an outline for different possible directions where the energy system would go depending on assumptions. It gives high-level examples of prices, consumption, emissions, and it can give to policymaker cost estimates. But it is a long-term and a continuous process. It involves expertise from many different disciplines, and it's mostly a framework to help think about the challenges which are faced by energy systems and the decisions that needs to be taken by policymaker. It is not about predicting the future, it's really about supporting decision making under uncertainties, under different assumptions.
So we come to the last part of our session. We'll discuss the Excel exercise that we sent to you. So I would like to just to show again this PDF document we sent to make sure that everyone received it with all the exercises here. So I think you discussed last week the statistics exercise, and this week we'll look at the modeling exercise. So number one is about an introduction. It's really an illustration. If some people have not received it, please reach out to us per email. We'll send again this document as well as the Excel one. So I start with the exercise, and then we'll do some question and answer. But feel free to ask your questions on what was just presented now, so that we can treat them all together at the end. So this exercise was about estimating future demand for oil products for the transport sector. So you were imagine the Ministry of Energy or Hydrocarbons or Ministry of Transport wants to anticipate what will be the demand for oil products in transport, and then what will be refinery activities, what will be the imports required, what will be the dependency on imports. Uh, as it's a very simplified model, we took a lot of very basic assumptions, but we have started building this Excel document as a very simplified one. We could go more into details in terms of disaggregation. We only consider one oil product, which is gasoline. We only consider passenger transport, and we do not look at buses. We do not look at trucks and any freight transport. We only include internal combustion engine, so thermal motors, and no electric cars. And we also have some simplification on the refinery sector. But this is a start. We can see together the mechanic, and then we, of course, there is always room for refining and disaggregating more to make such exercise more accurate. So before moving to making projections, we need to understand better our current situation. We need to understand better where we come from. So we look at the historical data first. And I will move to the Excel document itself. Okay, so I hope you will be able to see my screen. I will zoom, of course. Okay, so first question was about calculating the passenger kilometer variable in historical data. As we mentioned, this is a variable that gives a good indication of the intensity of passenger transport in the country, because it's made of and this is a calculation we've just done here, is made of the number of cars in the country multiplied by the average distance traveled by every car in a year, and multiplied by the occupancy rate, so number of people on average per car. All those data which are used as input here can come from surveys, they can come from the Ministry of Transport, who might be giving the license for cars. It can come also from other estimation we have, but we will build on them to see how this aggregated passenger kilometer indicator has evolved in the past. And we see that it reaches, it has a significant growth over time, and we'll be able to build on this to make some future projections. Question number two was to understand better efficiency for cars and to look at the average fuel consumption per car. And to do that, you were given the total gasoline demand, so all the oil products consumed in the country per year. And we also know all the kilometers traveled by all the cars. So we can deduct how much energy one car will consume on average per kilometer, and then we convert it to something which is more intuitive, which is liters per 100 kilometers. And what we can see under the data we put here as example is that the efficiency of cars has improved, because in the year 2000, one car on average was consuming 13 liters per 100 kilometer, and in 2018 this number went down to 11 liters per 100 kilometers. So again, we can see past trends, and we'll work on that to make our projections. Question 3 is actually about looking ahead, and about what would be we want to estimate how energy coming from transport and cars will evolve in the future, and what we will calculate is the total stock of cars. And this resonates with what you answered on the mentee question. If we want to understand future oil demand for the transport sector, what is the most important parameter? You all answered that it's a number of cars. It's not the only one, but it is the one we will calculate here. But to make this calculation, we also need to take some assumptions, because number of cars can be deducted from the passenger kilometer indicator we just discussed. And this passenger kilometer indicator, we have seen how it evolved over time. So if I expand every year, we have seen that over the last 10 years, it has grown at an average pace of 7%. So we will take a basic assumption that it will keep growing at the same 7% pace. Then we have looked also at how the average kilometers per traveled per car has evolved over time, and we will also assume that it will continue rising year after year. So in 2019, each car will travel on average 50 kilometers more than before, etc., etc. And we'll also assume that the occupancy rate, number of people on average per car, will remain stable. And projecting our parameters here and relying on the assumptions we just took, we will be able to deduct how the car fleet is to evolve. And under those hypotheses, we see that we have a doubling of the number of cars. We had 345,000 cars in the year 2010, and this will double to 700,000 by 2030. So interesting to see this projection. But what is really interesting to us are the impacts for energy demand. And here we will also make projections based on the efficiency level of each car. So we have calculated how much oil is consuming one car on average. We have seen that there has been improvements over a year, that it has decreased, and again the average improvement rate was at 1% per year. So we will assume that from now and ahead, every year there will also be a 1% decrease in energy consumed by cars, because the fleet of car will be more recent, more modern, and when we take the average, we will get better consumption levels. And taking this assumption, we can make projection on the average fuel consumption, and we can deduct total oil demand, because we know how many cars are in the country, and we know how much fuel one car will consume per kilometer, and we know how much kilometers cars on average will travel. So here again, we can see under our exercise a doubling of the oil demand. So this was looking only at demand. Now what we can do is to see how we can supply and this demand, how we can match this demand for energy. And in this exercise, we took the hypothesis that there were some refineries in the country, so there is an ability to produce gasoline for those transport needs. And here what we'll try to do is to see how refinery outputs would evolve and how imports of gasoline would evolve consequently, because whatever we are not able to produce in the domestic refineries for the domestic market, we will need to import so that we can match the demand for oil products. And here again, we will take the assumption that refineries activity will increase. We were given historical data on refinery outputs over the last 2 decades, and we can again try to understand what the evolution has been. Very basically, we can say, okay, let's imagine it will grow at a 2% rate per year. Here, if we know that there are some policies in the country and that a new refinery unit is to come online in 2 years and that will increase by 10% the capacity, this is something we can put in our scenario. But here, super simplified, we just put 2% growth rate every year. And we will deduct how refinery outputs increase. And once, as we know, the total demand for gasoline and the total gasoline produced in the country, we can subtract to know how much gasoline needs to be imported. And coming to question 6, what is interesting is that we can deduct the import dependency. So how dependent the country is on importing gasoline from overseas rather than making gasoline out of its domestic refineries. And the last part, which is where it really enter into analysis, is to put these into figures and charts. Sorry, it's a bit slow. So on the first one, you could see how over time um, oil passenger kilometer variable is to rise, how oil demand would also increase. Then we can look at the average fuel consumption, and you have a zoom on this second chart with the gray line, which is average fuel consumption decreasing because we have those efficiency improvements year after year. And the last part is about the imports. So absolute value imports of gasoline and the dependency ratio. So looking on the left part, we see how the country moves from importing 50 kilotons of oil equivalent to importing more than 200 kilotons of oil equivalent every year. And this means that the import dependency goes from 50% to something like 70%. And here, since we have entered some assumptions and hypothetical parameters, we can play with them and change them to see the impact. So for example, so here on our base case, dependency to imports is at 70%, which is very high, and the country would be super dependent on overseas imports. What if the energy efficiency improvements of the car fleets are higher? Let's imagine that the government takes stronger policies to avoid the importation of second-hand cars which are very old. So for example, no car can enter on the territory of Ghana if they are older than 13 years. So, or no car can be imported to Ghana if their efficiency level is above a certain threshold. Or every car which is more than 20 years is no more given any permits to be used on the roads. So there are several measures that can improve the overall efficiency of the fleet. And let's imagine that with very bold policies, improvements of the average fleet are not at 1% per year, but let's imagine they go at 3% per year. And then, so this will play on reducing the demand for oil. Then we can also imagine that with a strong policy on developing further the local refineries, there could be higher production of gasoline. So we were at 2% of annual increase in the refinery activities. If there are improvements in reducing losses, if there are some more efficient processes, if there are some extra investment, we can suppose that every year refinery outputs will grow, let's say, at 4%. And you can see that just by playing with those two parameters, if you look at our red line, which is the import dependency, instead of rising to 70%, it's maintained at 50%. So these are hypothetical data and case, but it's just to show the dynamic of building such a small Excel tool to make some predictions, looking at demand. What do people want? People want to travel. We assume they want to travel more every year. That there are, but there will be the same number of people per car, etc., etc. And we come back to final energy demand. Then we look at transformation process with the refinery, and last we look at the supply of those energies with imports, or we could have looked at the at also the production of crude oil and what that case entails for crude oil production. So I'm stopping here for the explanation on the exercise, and now very happy to look at the question. Oh, sorry, I had a remark on. I should have minimized myself so that you can see better. You will get the Excel file with corrections so that you can enter more into the detail. So you will have more time on that. Sorry. So question about the kilometer traveled per car. How can we obtain the data? So this is something you might have discussed with last week with my colleague Dakia and her colleagues. There can be different sources. It can be surveys. Sometimes this kind of information can be had at the Ministry of Transport, at the Ministry of Roads or Infrastructures. Again, before collecting new data, a good first reaction is always to wonder if anyone has already collected such data in a public agency, in a ministry, or in other international organization. Maybe there are international organizations working on transport or car transport in different countries, and they might have some data. So these are different suggestions and ideas. And then, as always, if we don't have data, we can try to estimate, looking at what similar countries are doing, looking at analogical situation in the past or in other regions. So, do we have global figures that can be used to estimate passenger kilometer and fuel consumption efficiency? So actually, those two variables are calculated in the model. In the case of passenger kilometer, I will show again. Passenger kilometer is defined as the total number of cars. So this comes to the previous question. Are we able to know how many cars they are in the country? Maybe looking at Ministry of Transport data or others. So total number of cars multiplied by the kilometers traveled per each car. This can come from a survey or any other data, again, most probably from the Ministry of Transport. And then occupancy rate per car, which is the number of people in each car. That can also come from survey or research done by different stakeholders. So we look for those input data, and then we calculate ourselves the passenger kilometer. Likewise, for the fuel consumption efficiency, in our assumption, in our exercise, what we have done is we have looked at the entire quantity of gasoline, of oil products consumed in the country, and this is the data that shall be available at the Ministry of Energy, or again maybe Ministry of Transport, of how many liters of diesel, how many liters of gasoline are sold for the transport sector. So this is of statistical data that could be available or estimated. And from this data, we have divided by the number of cars and their respective number of kilometers to estimate what is the average fuel consumption for each car per kilometer. These results shall be benchmarked against what we can know from other countries, what research would say. But here, when we've done the conversion to liters per 100 kilometer, those numbers might sound to make sense, saying that on average, all the cars in a country like Ghana would consume 11 liters per 100 kilometer. Might be relevant, still can be refined, but this is how we would calculate it. Again, so taking as input data the kilometers traveled per each car, the number of cars, and the oil consumed by all cars. I hope this answers. A question on calculate the import dependency. So again, in our very simplification way, what we've looked at is we're just looking at gasoline, so this and oil product, and saying the country needs 270 kilotons of oil equivalent of gasoline in 2030. There will be 141 that will come from the domestic refineries. So this gasoline will be produced in country, and to match the total demand, we need to import whatever is not coming from domestic refinery activity, and this would then, to get the import rate, we look at the amount imported divided by the total quantity of gasoline consumed. This ratio might not be super relevant, because we would need to go a bit more upstream, because when we think dependency, we're just looking at dependency to gasoline, or dependency to imports of gasoline. But what if these refineries in the country are using imported crude oil to make this domestically produced gasoline? Then this one is also relying on imports. So this ratio might not be the most relevant when we really want to understand how dependent a country is to fossil fuels in general. But we will have a more detailed Excel exercise and example in Friday session dedicated to fossil fuel. Okay, so we have another question, not related to the exercise, but to projections on the electricity mix of Africa. So let me just see if I can move to a slide that was referring to that. Yes. Okay, so I assume this question was related to this slide, where we look at how electricity demand could evolve in the future in Africa, and what would be the sources of supply to generate electricity and meet this demand. So here we're making the case for gas as a baseload source to rise significantly, as well as the increase of modern renewables, solar PV being the big winner, but also hydro coal to really rise, as well as wind. Other renewables would include the use of modern biomass. It would include geothermal, for example, and other sources could include nuclear as well as coal, even though in this scenario, I don't have in mind the number, but I think we don't expect coal to rise, considering the fact that we include climate goals and coal can be easily substituted by other sources for baseload power, like gas, for example. But so to answer your question, nuclear is indeed already part of the African electricity mix, with South Africa having nuclear plants, and it's been a few years or decades. Um, Looking ahead, some countries indeed are considering nuclear. I'm not very aware of Ghana plans for nuclear, so I'd be very happy to to understand more, to learn more on the timeline plan for Ghana to develop its nuclear nuclear entities and the expected size of the power plants. We can discuss this more Thursday when we will look at the power sector in general. But so we again, to make such case, we would look at sorry, when we do our stated policy scenario, we take into account announced policies and plans. So if a country like Ghana has set for itself goals to include nuclear, and to the extent that these plans are realistic and will be implemented in the coming years, we would of course take them into our scenario and include the development of nuclear in the coming years. When it comes to other scenario like our Africa case, where we don't follow what governments have announced, but we take them into account, of course, but we mostly set objectives like we need electricity demand to rise because of universal access to electricity, because of increased GDP, and then we will work on defining the adequate electricity mix. So it's not an easy task. You might know there are some merit order dispatch mechanism to define when a certain plant is operating and when not. When you include variable renewable energy in the mix, like solar PV, you need to take into account the fact that solar PV would be only producing during the sun time. So there are many elements to take into consideration, but we will look at all the existing technologies, and nuclear is indeed one of them. So we would include it if it makes sense, if it's the least cost solution, if it's under the policy taken or retained by the government. So we'll definitely include nuclear as one of the many technologies for power generation. So I think other renewables in this slide, I would need to check, but I expect it includes geothermal, which is a very dynamic power generation source for countries in the Horn of Africa, like Ethiopia, Djibouti, but mostly, and sorry, that's the first one country, which is Kenya, which is really the African champion on geothermal, if I recall correctly. So geothermal, and there could also be the modern use of biomass, for example, with pellets or other wood fuel byproducts, which are transformed and industrial, that can be used in thermal plants. We still have a couple of minutes, so happy to answer any other question or to give you the floor if someone wants to comment more
on Ghana plans for nuclear, on Ghana situation for transport and oil. Very happy to take any comment or feedback. Just raise your hand and you can then take the floor. Okay, if you don't have more questions, I'll stop here. Please, you can always send questions per email or through the WhatsApp group. But we can stop for now, and we'll meet tomorrow morning, same time, so 9 a.m. Accra time, and we'll really enter more into the details of doing energy modeling on understanding future energy demand. We'll illustrate with the building sector, and it's very interesting because in buildings there is need for electricity, of course, for lighting, for appliances, but there is also need for oil products for cooking, for example, with LPG, or sometimes for diesel, for backup diesel generator. There is need for biomass for cooking. So it's really an interesting subsector where you have very diverse energy needs and related energy fuels. So it will enable us to really understand how we move from the future energy services that people will want to how refinery, how power sector plants need to operate if we want to meet this demand. So I wish you a very good day to all of you, and talk to you tomorrow, same time, to continue on modeling. Have a good day.